When Jean Moulin stepped off the British submarine onto the dark shores of occupied France in January 1942, he carried something more dangerous than any weapon: the power to unite a divided resistance movement against Nazi tyranny. At 42, this former French prefect had already survived a brutal Gestapo interrogation and escaped to London. But now he was returning as Charles de Gaulle's secret envoy with a mission that could change the course of the war. The code name in his forged papers was Max, but the secret he carried would either liberate France or get him killed. Could you risk everything to unite bitter enemies in a common cause? The France that Jean returned to was a nation divided against itself. The German occupation had split the country not just geographically between the occupied North and Vichy South, but ideologically between collaborators, passive resistors, and active fighters. Dozens of small resistance groups operated independently, often viewing each other with as much suspicion as they showed toward the Germans. These groups had different political philosophies. Some were communist, others Gaullist, still others simply patriotic Frenchmen who wanted their country back. They used different methods, operated in different regions, and worst of all, they refused to coordinate their activities. German counterintelligence exploited these divisions ruthlessly, often using captured members of one group to destroy another. Jean's mission was to accomplish something that many considered impossible: forge these fractured resistance movements into a unified force that could effectively support the Allied invasion that everyone knew must come. But first, he had to survive in a country where the Gestapo had placed a massive bounty on his head, and where even fellow Frenchmen might betray him for a few extra food rations. The transformation from respectable government official to underground resistance leader had begun 2 years earlier in the town of Chartres, where Jean served as the youngest prefect in France. When German paratroopers occupied the town in June 1940, they demanded that he sign a document blaming Senegalese colonial troops for civilian casualties that had actually been caused by German bombing. Could you choose torture over signing a lie that would disgrace innocent men? Jean's refusal to sign the false document led to his first encounter with German brutality. SS officers beat him savagely, broke several ribs, and when he still refused to cooperate, they brought in specialized interrogators who used techniques designed to break even the strongest will. For hours, they tortured him while demanding his signature on the fabricated report. But Jean Moulin possessed something the Germans hadn't anticipated: an unbreakable core of personal integrity forged by years of public service and dedication to justice. Even as pain clouded his vision and blood ran down his face, he continued to refuse. His torturers, frustrated by his resistance, finally left him alone in a cell overnight, planning to resume their work in the morning. That night, rather than endure another day of torture that might eventually break his will, Jean attempted to cut his own throat with a piece of broken glass. The wound was serious but not fatal, and when German guards found him, they were forced to provide medical treatment. The self-inflicted injury actually saved his life. The Germans could no longer torture a man whose throat wounds required constant medical attention. More importantly, the incident demonstrated to both his captors and his fellow countrymen that Jean Moulin was willing to die rather than compromise his principles. Word of his resistance spread throughout the French administrative system, establishing a reputation for courage that would prove crucial in his later resistance work. But the real shock came when Jean discovered the true extent of French collaboration with the enemy. After his recovery and release from German custody, Jean began documenting the systematic collaboration between Vichy authorities and Nazi occupation forces. What he discovered was worse than mere administrative cooperation. It was active participation in persecution and deportation of Jews, political prisoners, and anyone deemed undesirable by the German authorities. French police were conducting raids, French officials were signing deportation orders, and French bureaucrats were managing the logistics of oppression with the same efficiency they had once applied to legitimate government functions. The moral rot went deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into every level of society. This revelation crystallized his understanding that passive resistance wasn't enough. France needed an organized, coordinated underground movement capable of both immediate sabotage and long-term preparation for liberation. Individual acts of defiance, while morally necessary, couldn't match the systematic efficiency of the occupation regime. The decision to escape to London and join de Gaulle's Free French movement was both personal and strategic. Jean understood that effective resistance required external support, coordination with Allied military planning, and most importantly, a legitimate governmental authority that could claim to represent the true France. The escape itself was an epic of determination and courage that would have challenged men half his age. What would you sacrifice to cross occupied Europe when every border guard was looking for escaped resistance fighters? Jean's journey to London in September 1941 required him to cross the entire width of occupied Europe under a false identity. The route took him through Vichy France, into Spain, where Francisco Franco's government maintained an ambiguous neutrality that made the country a deadly maze of competing intelligence services. Spanish police regularly arrested refugees attempting to reach Gibraltar, often turning them over to German agents for return to France. The mountain passes were patrolled by border guards who shot first and asked questions later. Even reaching the Spanish frontier required traveling through regions where the Gestapo maintained active surveillance, and French collaborators might recognize him at any moment. The most dangerous moment came at the Spanish border when guards discovered inconsistencies in his forged papers. For 3 hours, Jean was interrogated by Spanish police who seemed convinced he was either a spy or a fugitive. His fluent Spanish, learned during a posting in North Africa years earlier, probably saved his life by convincing the guards that he was indeed a legitimate businessman. After weeks of travel through Spain and Portugal, Jean finally reached London in October 1941, only to discover that his real mission was just beginning. You won't believe the impossible challenge that Charles de Gaulle presented to Jean in their first meeting. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French movement, was a man of enormous personal magnetism, but equally enormous ego. Tall, austere, and absolutely convinced of his historical destiny, de Gaulle had been trying for over a year to establish control over the various French resistance movements from his headquarters in London. The problem was that most resistance fighters inside France had never heard of de Gaulle, and those who had heard of him were often skeptical of his claims to represent French legitimacy. Communist resistance groups especially distrusted his conservative politics, while other factions questioned whether someone operating from London could understand conditions inside occupied France. De Gaulle's mission for Jean was breathtakingly audacious: return to France, locate and contact every major resistance organization, convince them to accept his leadership, and create a unified national resistance council that could coordinate military action with Allied invasion plans. Moulin, de Gaulle said during their first meeting, his piercing eyes fixed on Jean's face, "I am sending you back to accomplish what diplomats and generals have failed to achieve. You must make them understand that France cannot be liberated by isolated acts of sabotage. Only unified action under legitimate authority can restore our national dignity." The mission was complicated by the fact that Jean would be operating under deep cover, with minimal communication with London. Radio transmissions were dangerous because German radio detection equipment could locate transmitters within hours. Couriers were unreliable and often captured. Most communication would have to wait for scheduled submarine pickups that might occur only every few months. Could you accept such responsibility knowing that thousands of lives would depend on your success or failure? Jean's return to France in January 1942 marked the beginning of what many historians consider the most successful intelligence and coordination operation of World War II. Operating under the code name Max, he began the delicate process of contacting resistance leaders who had every reason to distrust outsiders and government officials. His first major success came with Henri Ferney, leader of the combat resistance movement in southern France. Ferney was a former army officer whose organization had grown from a small group of friends into a sophisticated network capable of intelligence gathering, sabotage, and assistance to Allied airmen shot down over France. But Ferney was also fiercely independent and suspicious of de Gaulle's motives. The initial meeting between Jean and Ferney, arranged through mutual contacts in Lyon, was tense and potentially dangerous for both men. "Why should we accept orders from London?" Ferney demanded. "We're the ones risking our lives every day while de Gaulle makes speeches on the BBC. What has he done to earn our loyalty?" Jean's response revealed the diplomatic skills that made him uniquely qualified for his mission. Instead of demanding submission to de Gaulle's authority, he focused on practical advantages of coordination. Unified intelligence could prevent resistance groups from accidentally sabotaging each other's operations. Combined logistics could ensure that weapons drops reached the groups that needed them most. Most importantly, coordinated action could multiply the military effectiveness of resistance activities. Wait a moment. What dangerous gamble would convince the resistance leaders that unity was their only hope? Jean's breakthrough came when he arranged something unprecedented: a secret meeting between leaders of the three largest resistance movements in unoccupied France. Combat, Liberation Sud, and Franc Tireur had operated independently for over 2 years, often competing for the same resources and occasionally interfering with each other's missions. The meeting was scheduled for May 1943 in a safe house near Lyon, but getting the leaders to attend required Jean to take enormous personal risks. He had to travel openly through Lyon, a city where the Gestapo maintained one of their most effective operations under the command of Klaus Barbie, the notorious Butcher of Lyon. Barbie's network of informers and collaborators had penetrated deep into Lyon society. Restaurants, hotels, train stations, and even churches were under surveillance. The Gestapo had developed sophisticated techniques for tracking resistance movements, using captured members to identify their colleagues and using radio intercepts to locate secret meeting places. Jean's plan for the meeting required split-second timing and perfect security. The three resistance leaders would arrive at different times, using separate routes and cover stories. The safe house belonged to a doctor whose medical practice provided legitimate reasons for visitors at odd hours. Most cleverly, Jean arranged for the meeting to coincide with a local religious festival that would provide crowd cover and distract police attention. The gathering itself was electric with tension. These men had been fighting the same enemy for years, but had never met face to face. Personal rivalries, ideological differences, and mutual suspicions threatened to derail any hope of cooperation. What you've seen is nothing. The most crucial moment would test Jean's powers of persuasion to their limits. The resistance leaders' initial exchanges were polite but wary. Emmanuel Dastier de la Vigerie of Liberation Sud was an intellectual who believed resistance should focus on political preparation for post-war France. Henry Frenay wanted immediate military action against German targets. Jean-Pierre Renant of Franc-Tireur advocated for sabotage operations that would support Allied military planning. Each man had valid points, but their disagreements threatened to fragment French resistance just when unity was becoming crucial. Allied invasion planning was accelerating, and resistance coordination would be essential for supporting the massive military operation that everyone knew was coming. Jean listened carefully to each leader's concerns before making what many consider one of the most persuasive speeches in resistance history. Instead of lecturing them about patriotic duty or de Gaulle's authority, he focused on practical realities that each man could understand. "Gentlemen," Jean said quietly, "while we debate organizational structures, the Gestapo is systematically destroying our networks. Last month, they arrested 47 resistance members in the Marseille area. This month, they've penetrated our radio communications in 3 different regions. We're losing this war not because we lack courage, but because we lack coordination." He produced documents showing German counterintelligence successes against uncoordinated resistance groups. The evidence was devastating. Dozens of operations had failed because different groups didn't know what others were planning. Weapons drops had been wasted because multiple groups requested supplies for the same targets. Most importantly, captured resistance members were being used to destroy other groups because no one knew who was working where. The presentation was masterful because it appealed to each leader's self-interest while demonstrating the broader necessity for cooperation. Within hours, the foundation for Unified Resistance Command was established. Unbelievable as it seems, the moment of greatest triumph would also bring Jean's greatest danger. The success of the Lyon meeting led to the establishment of the National Resistance Council in May 1943, with Jean as its first chairman. For the first time since the occupation began, French resistance groups were working under unified command structure, coordinating intelligence, sharing resources, and planning joint operations. The psychological impact was enormous. Resistance members throughout France began to believe that liberation was not just possible, but inevitable. Recruitment dramatically increased as ordinary French citizens saw evidence that the underground had become a serious military force rather than a collection of amateur enthusiasts. But success also brought increased German attention. Klaus Barbie's Gestapo unit had been tracking Jean's activities for months, using infiltrators, radio intercepts, and captured resistance members to piece together the identity of the mysterious Max, who seemed to be at the center of increased resistance coordination. The breakthrough for German counterintelligence came from an unexpected source: internal resistance politics. Communist resistance groups, while officially part of the Unified Command, maintained their own intelligence networks and pursued their own agendas. Some communist operatives believed that eliminating non-communist resistance leaders would give them control of the movement after liberation. On June 21, 1943, Jean attended what he thought was a routine resistance meeting in the Lyon suburb of Calais. The meeting had been arranged to discuss coordination between different resistance cells, but someone had betrayed the location to the Gestapo. Yet, could Jean's capture have been prevented if he had trusted his instincts about the meeting's suspicious circumstances? Jean had actually sensed something wrong about the Calais meeting from the beginning. The location was changed at the last minute, always a dangerous sign in underground work. Several participants were people he didn't recognize, and the agenda seemed unnecessarily vague for such a high-risk gathering. His security instincts, honed by 2 years of underground operations, urged him to abort the meeting and reschedule under better circumstances. But the pressure to maintain coordination between resistance groups overrode his caution. Too many operations depended on the decisions that would be made at this meeting. When the Gestapo agents surrounded the house and burst through the doors, Jean immediately attempted to destroy the documents he carried. These papers contain names, addresses, and operational details that could destroy the entire resistance network if they fell into German hands. But Barbie's men had been trained for exactly this scenario. Within seconds, Jean was unconscious from a blow to the head, and his documents were secured before he could destroy them. The capture was so swift and professional that other meeting participants barely had time to react before they too were in custody. The interrogation that followed would become legendary for both its brutality and Jean's absolute refusal to cooperate despite torture that would have broken most men. Suddenly, the final test of Jean's character would determine the fate of the entire French resistance movement. Klaus Barbie personally conducted Jean's interrogation, recognizing that he had captured someone of enormous importance to the resistance movement. The Butcher of Lyon was notorious throughout occupied Europe for his innovative torture techniques and his ability to break even the most determined prisoners. For 3 weeks, Jean endured interrogation sessions that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. Barbie's methods included systematic beatings, electric shock, and psychological torture designed to destroy his prisoners' will to resist. The Gestapo wanted names, addresses, operational plans, and most importantly, the identity of resistance leaders who were still at large. Jean revealed nothing. Despite torture that left him barely conscious and permanently damaged his health, he maintained the cover story that he was simply a minor resistance courier with no knowledge of important operations or leadership structures. The psychological pressure was as devastating as the physical torture. Jean knew that his captured documents had already compromised many resistance members, and he could hear the screams of other prisoners being tortured in nearby cells. The knowledge that his mission had failed and that his comrades were suffering because of his capture added emotional torment to physical agony. But he also understood that revealing what he knew would destroy the entire resistance network. The names and addresses in his memory represented hundreds of brave French men and women who were continuing the fight for liberation. His silence, however painful, was protecting their lives and preserving the organization he had worked so hard to create. And then, on July 8, 1943, Jean Moulin died in German custody, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The official German report claimed that Jean died of a heart attack during routine questioning, but witnesses reported that his body showed signs of systematic torture that had continued until the moment of his death. Barbie had pushed his prisoner beyond human limits, and Jean's body had finally surrendered, even though his spirit never broke. The news of Jean's death sent shockwaves throughout the resistance movement. For many fighters, he had represented hope that France could be liberated through coordinated action rather than futile gestures of defiance. His death seemed to symbolize the impossibility of defeating the German occupation machine. But Jean's legacy proved more powerful than his physical presence had been. The organizational structure he had created survived his death and continued to coordinate resistance activities throughout 1943 and 1944. The National Resistance Council provided crucial support for the D-Day invasion, conducting sabotage operations that disrupted enemy communications and transportation networks at critical moments. Could such sacrifice ever be truly repaid by the freedom it helped secure? The liberation of France in 1944 vindicated Jean's vision of unified resistance action. Resistance forces coordinating under the structure he had established played crucial roles in liberating major cities before Allied forces arrived. Paris rose in rebellion on August 19, 1944, with resistance fighters holding key positions until General Leclerc's armored division arrived to complete the liberation. Throughout France, the infrastructure that Jean had built proved its worth. Resistance intelligence networks provided Allied commanders with detailed information about German positions and movements. Sabotage operations disrupted enemy communications and transportation networks. Most importantly, the unified command structure prevented the civil war that might have erupted if different resistance factions had competed for control of liberated territory. After the war, Jean Moulin's heroism was recognized by both French and Allied authorities. Charles de Gaulle, in his memoirs, called Jean the most important agent in the history of the French resistance. British intelligence officials credited him with creating the most effective resistance network in occupied Europe. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from ordinary French resistance members who had worked under his coordination. They remembered not just his organizational genius, but his personal courage in visiting dangerous areas to meet with local commanders, his willingness to share the risks faced by every underground fighter, and his absolute refusal to betray his comrades even under the worst torture the Gestapo could devise. On January 12, 1964, Jean Moulin's remains were transferred to the Pantheon in Paris, the final resting place reserved for France's greatest heroes. The ceremony, attended by resistance veterans and government officials from around the world, marked the formal recognition that a former civil servant had become one of the most important figures in French history. André Malraux, speaking at the ceremony, captured the essence of Jean's contribution. He organized hope at a time when hope seemed impossible, and he died rather than betray the men and women who had trusted him with their lives. What lessons can we learn from a man who chose unity over division and sacrifice over survival? Today, Jean Moulin's story serves as a reminder that individual courage can change the course of history when it's combined with strategic thinking and personal integrity. His success in unifying the French resistance demonstrates that even the most bitter enemies can be brought together when they face a common threat to their fundamental values.
Perhaps most importantly, Jean's refusal to break under torture illustrates the power of moral conviction to overcome physical limitations. His torturers possessed every advantage: superior numbers, sophisticated techniques, unlimited time, and absolute power over their prisoner's life and death. But they could not break a man who valued his principles more than his own survival. The France that Jean died to liberate has become a beacon of democratic values and international cooperation. The resistance networks he organized evolved into political parties and civic organizations that helped rebuild French democracy after the war. The unity he forged between different resistance factions provided a foundation for the social consensus that enabled France's post-war recovery. His legacy lives on in every person who chooses to resist tyranny, who works to unite rather than divide, and who understands that some things are worth dying for. The prefect who refused to sign a lie, the resistance leader who united bitter enemies, and the prisoner who died rather than betray his comrades represents the highest potential of human courage and integrity. Jean Moulin proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they possess the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances and the courage to act on their deepest convictions regardless of personal cost. Would you have found the same strength to unite enemies and face death rather than betray those who trusted you? His story reminds us that heroes are made not by supernatural powers, but by ordinary people who choose to do what is right when everything depends on their decision. Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to discover more incredible stories of courage and sacrifice from history's darkest and brightest moments.